Beneath the sands of modern-day Iraq lie clay tablets older than the Bible, older than the pyramids, older than any written record we've ever found. The Sumerians, humanity's first civilization, left us thousands of these tablets, and within their strange wedge-shaped writing, they recorded something extraordinary, the story of beings called the Anunnaki, who they claimed created humanity itself. But here is what troubles researchers most. The Sumerians also wrote of 7 moments in human history that were deliberately erased from our collective memory. 7 events so significant, so transformative, that the Anunnaki themselves decided we must never remember them. Tonight, we journey into forgotten time to recover what was taken. In the middle of the 19th century, European archaeologists began digging into the ancient mounds of Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now modern Iraq. And what they found there would challenge everything scholars thought they knew about the origins of human civilization. Beneath layers of sand and forgotten centuries, they uncovered the remains of cities so old that even the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians had considered them relics of a distant past. And within these cities they found something extraordinary. Hundreds of thousands of clay tablets covered in strange wedge-shaped marks that would come to be known as cuneiform, the oldest form of writing ever discovered. As translators slowly decoded these tablets over the following decades, a picture emerged of a people called the Sumerians. And this picture presented what academics would come to call the Sumerian problem, a mystery that has never been adequately solved. You see, civilizations normally develop gradually over thousands of years, moving from simple hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural settlements, to villages, to towns, and finally to cities with all the complex institutions that urban life requires. But the Sumerians seem to skip these developmental phases entirely, appearing in the archaeological record around 4500 BCE, with their sophisticated culture already fully formed, possessing writing and mathematics and astronomy and architecture and law and literature, as if these things had simply been handed to them complete. Henry Rawlinson, one of the first to decipher cuneiform, remarked on this anomaly, as did later scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer, who devoted his life to translating Sumerian texts and who never ceased to marvel at how this civilization seemed to emerge from nowhere, leaving no trace of the slow developmental progress that characterizes every other ancient culture we have studied. The great cities of Sumer, places with names like Eridu and Ur and Uruk and Nippur and Lagash, did not grow organically from small settlements, but appeared as if planned from the beginning, with massive temple complexes called ziggurats rising at their centers, administrative buildings surrounding them, and residential areas spreading outward in organized patterns that suggest central planning of a kind not seen again until much later in human history. In Nippur alone, archaeologists discovered a library containing over 30,000 tablets, administrative records and literary texts and astronomical observations, and medical treatises and legal documents, all written with a precision and sophistication that seemed impossible for what should have been one of humanity's earliest civilizations. The University of Pennsylvania excavations at Nippur in the late 1800s and early 1900s revealed room after room filled with these tablets, many still awaiting translation more than a century later, and similar discoveries at Ur and Eridu and other sites added tens of thousands more to the collection, a vast archive of human knowledge from the very dawn of recorded history. What makes these tablets so remarkable is not merely their age, but their state of preservation. For while papyrus crumbles and parchment decays, and even stone inscriptions weather away over millennia, clay tablets, when baked either intentionally or accidentally through the fires that destroyed the cities that housed them, become nearly indestructible, ceramic records that can survive for thousands of years with their contents perfectly legible. And so, the Sumerians' gift to us was preserved, not despite the catastrophes that befell their civilization, but because of them, the very fires that ended their world, baking their words into permanence. Today, these tablets are scattered across museums and universities around the world, in the British Museum and the Louvre and the University of Pennsylvania and dozens of other institutions. And scholars estimate that only a fraction have been fully translated, perhaps 10 or 20%, meaning that the vast majority of what the Sumerians wanted to tell us remains unread, waiting in climate-controlled storage rooms for future generations of scholars to decode. What we have translated reveals a society of remarkable sophistication, for these were not primitive people scratching simple marks into clay, but a civilization capable of complex thought and careful record-keeping and advanced calculation. Their administrative records show us a society with specialized professions and international trade and complex taxation systems and detailed property laws, the kind of bureaucratic infrastructure we associate with modern nations, not ancient city-states. Their mathematical tablets reveal a base 60 numerical system that we still use today every time we divide an hour into 60 minutes or a minute into 60 seconds or a circle into 360 degrees, are a system that allowed them to perform calculations of surprising accuracy. Their astronomical records contain observations of planetary movements and stellar positions that should have required centuries of careful watching to compile. Yet, they seemed to possess this knowledge from the very beginning of their civilization, as if they had inherited it rather than discovered it. Their medical texts describe surgical procedures and pharmaceutical preparations and diagnostic methods that would not be matched again until the Greek and Roman periods, thousands of years later. And their literary texts include the oldest known stories in human history, tales of creation and flood, and heroic journeys that would later appear in modified form in the scriptures of every major religion. The Epic of Gilgamesh, found on these tablets, tells the story of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, a story recorded in Sumer more than 1,000 years before the biblical account of Noah. And the similarities between the two accounts are too striking to be coincidental, suggesting either a common source or direct transmission from the older Sumerian version to the later Hebrew one. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws heavily on earlier Sumerian sources, describes the formation of the heavens and the earth and the creation of humanity in terms that find echoes in the opening chapters of Genesis. And the Atrahasis, perhaps the most important text for our purposes tonight, describes in detail how and why humanity was created and what nearly destroyed us all. But here we encounter a problem that has troubled scholars since these tablets were first translated. The problem of how to read texts that make no distinction between what we would call history and what we would call mythology. When the Sumerians recorded their astronomical observations, they did so with the same careful attention to detail and the same matter-of-fact tone that they used when recording the activities of their gods. And when they compiled their king lists, documenting the rulers of their cities in chronological order. They included, alongside historical kings, whose existence archaeology has confirmed other kings, with reign lengths measured not in decades, but in tens of thousands of years. The Sumerian king list, one of the most fascinating documents to survive from the ancient world, begins with a phrase that has haunted researchers since it was first translated. When kingship descended from heaven, it went first to Eridu, and then it lists the kings who ruled in that primordial time. Kings with names like Alulim, who reigned for 28,800 years, and Alangar, who reigned for 36,000 years. Impossible numbers that must surely be mythological, yet they are recorded in the same format and with the same apparent seriousness as the later kings whose historical existence we can verify. After these impossible early reigns, the king list notes that the flood swept over the land, and after the flood, kingship descended from heaven once more, this time with reign lengths that gradually become more believable, shrinking from thousands of years to hundreds, to finally the decades we would expect from human rulers. Scholars have debated endlessly what to make of this document, whether the early reign lengths are purely symbolic or represent some different counting system, or record some truth that we simply cannot understand with our modern assumptions about human lifespans, and no consensus has ever been reached, the mystery remaining as deep now as it was when the tablet was first translated. What we can say is that the Sumerians themselves seem to have believed they were recording history, not inventing mythology, for they made no distinction between these categories, treating the activities of their gods with the same documentary seriousness they brought to recording grain shipments and legal disputes and astronomical observations. When they wrote about the beings they called the Anunnaki, they did not write about them as we might write about fairy tales or folk legends, but as we might write about powerful foreign rulers who had once governed our land, documenting their conflicts and councils and decisions with the specificity of diplomatic records, naming specific individuals and specific locations and specific actions taken at specific times. The Anunnaki were not vague spiritual presences, but distinct personalities with names and portfolios and relationships and disagreements, a governing council of beings who the Sumerians insisted had come from somewhere else, somewhere beyond the sky, and who had shaped human civilization from its very beginning. The word Anunnaki itself offers a clue to how the Sumerians understood these beings, for it can be translated as those of royal blood or the princely offspring, but also, in some interpretations, as those who from heaven to earth came, suggesting beings of celestial origin who descended to our world for purposes of their own. They were not worshipped as remote cosmic forces, but dealt with as immediate presences who had walked among the first humans, who had taught them the arts of civilization, who had built the first cities and established the first temples, and set the patterns that human society would follow ever after. And according to the texts, according to these oldest records of human memory, the Anunnaki did something else as well, something that we will explore as our journey tonight continues. For the tablets tell us that these beings not only created human civilization, but also shaped human consciousness itself, deciding what we would remember and what we would forget, What knowledge would be passed down through the generations, and what knowledge would be hidden away in the darkness of our collective amnesia? The Sumerians documented everything, their laws and their trades, and their astronomical observations, and their medical procedures and their literary traditions. And with that same careful attention to detail, they documented their creators, beings who came from beyond the sky, beings who made humanity for a purpose, beings called the Anunnaki. And now we come to the beings themselves, these Anunnaki, whose name echoes through thousands of clay tablets, whose stories the Sumerians recorded with the same careful attention they gave to grain inventories and legal contracts, and to understand what they may have taken from human memory. We must first understand who they were, what they wanted, and why they came to this small blue world spinning in the vastness of space. The Sumerian texts describe a hierarchy among these beings, a structure of authority that mirrors, in some ways, the royal courts the Sumerians themselves would later establish. And at the very top of this cosmic order sat Anu, whose name simply means sky or heaven. The father figure who ruled from a distant celestial realm and rarely, if ever, set foot upon the earth, preferring instead to govern through his children and appointed representatives, receiving reports and issuing decrees from his throne among the stars. Beneath Anu, in this divine hierarchy, stood two brothers whose relationship would shape the fate of humanity itself. And the first of these was Enlil, whose name translates roughly as Lord of Command or Lord of the Air. And Enlil served as the chief administrator of the Earth mission, the one who maintained order, enforced rules, and made the difficult decisions that governing required. And the texts consistently portray him as stern, focused on protocol, concerned with maintaining the boundaries between the divine and the earthly, between the Anunnaki and the creatures they would create. The second brother was Enki, Lord of the Earth, Lord of the Sweet Waters. And where Enlil was rigid, Enki was creative. Where Enlil was distant, Enki was curious. Where Enlil saw problems, Enki saw puzzles waiting to be solved. And the texts describe Enki as a scientist and inventor, a being of immense knowledge who delighted in understanding how things worked and how they might be made to work differently. And it was Enki who would become humanity's advocate, defender, and, in many ways, our secret father. Below these great powers existed a council of divine beings, the 50 great gods and the 7 gods who decree. And the Sumerian texts describe meetings where matters of cosmic importance were debated and decided, votes taken, arguments heard, compromises reached. And this council structure appears again and again in the narratives, suggesting that even beings of such immense power operated within a system of shared governance rather than absolute individual rule. But what were these beings actually like according to the ancient scribes who claimed to record their nature? And here the texts offer details that may surprise those expecting purely ethereal or spiritual entities. For the Anunnaki, as described, required food and drink. They grew weary and needed rest. They experienced pleasure and pain. They argued and reconciled. They loved and they grieved. They made mistakes and sometimes regretted them. In short, they possessed what we might call personalities, temperaments, individual characteristics that distinguished one from another, just as human individuals differ from one another. The Sumerians described technologies in the only terms available to them, speaking of flying vehicles called Shem or Mu that could traverse the sky, of weapons that could level mountains and boil seas, of devices that allowed communication across vast distances, of instruments that could manipulate the very building blocks of life. And while we cannot know exactly what the Sumerians were attempting to describe, their consistent inclusion of such details suggests they were recording what they believed they had witnessed or been told by those who had witnessed, not inventing fantastical flourishes to embellish simple myths. And now we come to a question that pulses beneath all of these ancient narratives like a heartbeat beneath skin. Why were they here? What purpose brought these beings across the cosmic distances to this particular world? And the texts offer an answer that is both surprisingly specific and deeply unsettling. They came for gold. The tablets describe a mining operation of planetary scale, a mission to extract gold from the earth and transport it to their home world. And while the precise reason for needing this gold varies across different textual interpretations, ranging from atmospheric engineering to biological necessities, the consistent thread is that Earth represented a resource colony, a place of extraction rather than inherent value. But mining is labor, and labor requires laborers. And here the texts describe a problem that would lead directly to humanity's creation for the Anunnaki who worked. The minds grew weary, they complained, they protested the endless toil, and eventually their frustration reached the point of rebellion, the workers refusing to continue the back-breaking work of extraction. And this labor crisis prompted a council meeting that would change everything. A gathering where the fate of an entire species would be decided before that species even existed. The solution came from Enki, clever Enki, inventive Enki, who proposed creating a new being to bear the burden of work. A creature that would combine the intelligence needed for labor with the obedience needed for service. And the texts describe in remarkable detail the process by which this creation was attempted and eventually achieved. A mixing of divine essence with earthly clay, a blending of Anunnaki blood with the genetic material of creatures already existing on Earth. Working alongside Enki was Ninmah, the great mother goddess, also known as Ninhursag or Ninti, whose name Lady of the Rib offers an intriguing echo to later creation narratives. And Ninmah served as what we might now call a genetic engineer, her skilled hands shaping the new creature, her knowledge guiding the delicate process of combining disparate biological elements into something viable, something that could live and work and reproduce. The texts describe failed attempts, creatures that could not hold water, that could not walk properly, that could not reproduce, experiments that went wrong before the formula was perfected, and finally, success. The creation of the Lulu Amelu, the primitive worker, the being who would take up the tools and descend into the mines and free the Anunnaki from their burden of toil. And this being, according to these ancient tablets, was us, humanity itself, designed for a purpose we were never meant to remember. Consider what this narrative implies about the relationship between humanity and these beings during those early times. A relationship of creator and created, master and servant, those who command and those who comply. And yet the texts also suggest that this simple hierarchy grew complicated over time, for the new creatures proved more capable than expected, more curious, more willful, more beautiful in their own way. And some among the Anunnaki began to feel something like affection for their creations, while others viewed them with contempt or fear. Enki, in particular, seemed to regard humanity with a kind of parental pride that went beyond simple satisfaction at a successful experiment. And the texts repeatedly show him advocating for human interests, sharing knowledge that others wished to keep hidden, protecting humans from destruction when other Anunnaki had voted for their extinction. And this division between those who valued humanity and those who saw us only as tools would create tensions that echo through thousands of years of recorded narrative. The Anunnaki gave humanity the gifts of civilization, teaching the arts of agriculture and animal husbandry, the science of astronomy and mathematics, the craft of writing and law, and the Sumerians credited every advancement, every piece of knowledge that distinguished their society from wilderness existence, to these divine teachers who had walked among them in the ancient days. But knowledge given can also be knowledge withheld, and the texts hint at boundaries, at secrets kept, at information deemed too dangerous or too powerful for human minds. And here we approach the central mystery of our exploration tonight. For if the Anunnaki controlled what knowledge humanity received, what knowledge did they decide humanity must never possess? The concept of dangerous knowledge appears repeatedly in these narratives. The tree whose fruit must not be eaten, the secret name that confers power, the forbidden chamber that must never be entered, and always the suggestion that human curiosity pressing against these boundaries represented a threat to the established order, a disruption to the careful relationship between the divine and the earthly. The texts even describe what we might call precedents for memory manipulation, moments when human awareness was deliberately limited, when perception was altered, when the full truth of a situation was hidden behind a veil of forgetting. And these references scattered through the tablets suggest that the 7 great erasures we are about to explore were not anomalies, but rather the most significant examples of a practice the Anunnaki employed throughout their dealings with humanity. And so, we come to the heart of our journey tonight, for the Anunnaki, according to these ancient texts, made 7 decisions to alter human memory, 7 events they determined we must not recall. Some of these events happened before humanity existed in its current form, some happened to our earliest ancestors, and some may explain the strange gaps in our own collective memory, the persistent feeling that something important has been forgotten, that we once knew things we no longer know, that the story we tell ourselves about our own origins is missing crucial chapters. The first erased event takes us back to the very beginning, back before the mines were dug, back before the council met, back to the moment when our species was still just an idea in the mind of Enki. And what was taken from us, there was perhaps the most fundamental knowledge of all, the true nature of our own creation. And now we arrive at the heart of our journey tonight. The 7 events that, according to these ancient Sumerian texts, were deliberately removed from the collective memory of humanity. 7 moments of such profound significance that the Anunnaki themselves determined we must never remember them. And as we explore each of these erased memories together, allow yourself to sink deeper into this mystery, letting the words carry you back through thousands upon thousands of years, to a time when the world was younger and the gods still walked among us. The first erased event concerns the most fundamental question any human being can ask, the question of where we come from and how we came to exist. And according to the Sumerian texts, particularly the ancient narrative known as the Atrahasis, our origin was not the slow process of natural evolution, nor the instantaneous miracle of divine creation as later traditions would describe it, but rather something far more deliberate and far more strange, an act of engineering carried out by beings who needed workers and possessed the knowledge to create them. The tablets tell us that the Anunnaki gods had come to Earth on a mission, a great labor that required them to dig channels and mine the depths of the Earth. And for countless years, the lower-ranking gods called the Igigi performed this back-breaking work, until eventually they could bear it no longer and rose up in rebellion against their superiors, refusing to continue the endless toil that had been assigned to them. It was in the aftermath of this divine rebellion that Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh waters, proposed a solution that would change everything, suggesting to the assembly of gods that they create a new being to bear the burden of labor in place of the Igigi, a primitive worker called the Lulu who would free the gods from their toil forever. The tablets describe in remarkable detail what happened next, how the goddess Ninmah, who was skilled in the arts of creation and medicine, took clay from the earth and mixed it with the blood and essence of a god who had been sacrificed for this purpose. How she shaped this mixture in special molds and spoke the words of power over them. How the first attempts produced beings that were malformed or unable to function properly, blind or paralyzed, or unable to control their bodies. Each failure teaching her something new until finally she achieved success, and the first true humans emerged from the process, capable of understanding commands and performing the work that had been intended for them. What the texts seem to describe, when read with modern eyes, sounds remarkably like a process of genetic manipulation. The combining of existing genetic material from an earth creature, symbolized by the clay, with the genetic material of the Anunnaki themselves, symbolized by the divine blood, to create a hybrid being that possessed the intelligence to follow instructions and the physical capability to perform labor, but was not so advanced as to challenge its creators. And whether we interpret this literally or metaphorically, the Sumerians clearly believed that humanity was fashioned with purpose and intention by beings who had specific needs we were created to fulfill. According to the texts, this memory was the first to be erased from human consciousness, and we might understand why such a memory would be considered dangerous by those who created us. For what happens to a species that learns it was engineered as a worker class? That its very existence was predicated not on love or cosmic necessity, but on the practical need for labor. Such knowledge might cause humanity to question its purpose, to seek out its creators and demand explanations, or perhaps to reject the work it had been designed to perform. And so the memory was lifted from us like a veil being drawn across the mind, leaving us to wonder about our origins without ever quite being able to grasp the truth that once we knew instinctively. Even today, we feel the echo of this erased memory in our persistent questions about human origins, in the strange gap that exists in our evolutionary record, in our inexplicable drive to search the stars for evidence of other beings, and in the deep unease that sometimes stirs within us when we contemplate whether we might be alone in the universe, as if some part of us remembers that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, that the beings who made us may still be watching from somewhere beyond our sight. If our very creation was an act of engineering, then perhaps it is no surprise that the second erased memory concerns what we were designed to replace. For the tablets speak of beings who existed on Earth before humanity took its first steps, beings whose memory has faded almost entirely from our collective consciousness. The second erased event reaches even further back in time, to an era before the Lulu walked the earth, when other intelligent creatures tended the gardens of the gods and served in the temples that rose above the fertile plains. And the Sumerian texts contain tantalizing references to these earlier inhabitants, speaking of them in fragments and whispers, as though even the ancient scribes were uncertain about the details of these forgotten predecessors. Some passages describe earlier attempts at creating a worker species, beings that were stronger than humans or longer lived, but possessed some fatal flaw that made them unsuitable for the purposes of the gods, were perhaps too aggressive or too independent or too limited in their ability to learn and adapt. And these failed models were apparently abandoned or destroyed, their physical traces buried deep beneath the sediments of time. Other texts speak of the Igigi themselves, the younger gods who served the greater Anunnaki and who labored on Earth before humanity existed, suggesting that there was an entire civilization of divine or semi-divine beings operating on our planet for millennia before the first human drew breath, building structures and mining resources and shaping the Earth according to plans we can no longer comprehend. Perhaps most intriguing are the scattered references to giants that appear not only in Sumerian texts, but in the mythologies of cultures around the world. Beings of enormous stature who once walked the earth and whose bones, some researchers speculate, may still lie hidden in places we have not thought to look or have been conditioned to ignore. And these giants are sometimes described as the offspring of gods and humans, suggesting a period of interbreeding between the Anunnaki and early humanity that produced a hybrid race of tremendous physical power. The memory of these predecessors was erased, the texts suggest, because knowledge of them would raise uncomfortable questions about the cycles of creation and destruction that have occurred on this planet, prompting humanity to wonder whether we too are merely a temporary experiment destined to be replaced when a better model is developed. And such thoughts would breed anxiety and despair rather than the contented labor the gods desired from their new creation. We see echoes of this erased memory in the giant legends that persist across every culture, in the archaeological anomalies that mainstream science struggles to explain, in our fascination with the possibility of prehistoric advanced civilizations, and in the nagging sense that the history we have been taught is somehow incomplete, as though crucial chapters have been torn from the book of time and hidden where we cannot find them. These forgotten predecessors were not the last to be erased from our memory, and the third event concerns something humanity once possessed and lost, a gift so precious that its removal fundamentally altered what it means to be human. The third erased event addresses one of the deepest mysteries embedded in the ancient texts, the incredible lifespans recorded for the earliest humans and the kings who ruled before a great catastrophe swept across the earth. Numbers so vast that modern scholars have largely dismissed them as symbolic or mistranslated, yet the Sumerians recorded them with the same careful precision they applied to their astronomical observations and commercial transactions. The Sumerian king list, one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world, records the reigns of rulers who governed before the flood, in terms that seem impossible by our current understanding, stating that the first king Alulim ruled for 28,800 years in the city of Eridu, and after him Alalingar ruled for 36,000 years. and so on through a list of 8 kings whose combined reigns totaled 241,200 years before the flood swept over the land and kingship was taken up to heaven. After the flood, the king list shows a dramatic and consistent reduction in reign lengths, dropping first to thousands of years, then to hundreds, and finally approaching the normal human lifespan we recognize today, as though something fundamental had changed in the human constitution, some capacity for longevity that had been deliberately diminished. The texts hint at an explanation for these extraordinary lifespans, speaking of the food of the gods and the water of life that could extend existence far beyond natural limits, and of a tree of life whose fruit granted immortality or something close to it. Gifts that were given to early humanity but later withdrawn when the gods determined that such longevity made humans too dangerous, too capable of accumulating wisdom and power that might eventually rival that of their creators. We find remarkable parallels in the Hebrew scriptures, where the early patriarchs similarly lived for hundreds of years, with Methuselah reaching 969 years and Adam himself living for 930. And these lifespans also decreased steadily after the flood until they reached the 70 years that we now consider the natural human allotment, suggesting a shared memory of longevity lost that both cultures inherited from some common source. The memory of our original lifespan was erased, the texts imply, because it would cause unbearable grief to know what we once possessed and can never reclaim, and because knowledge of how our lives were shortened might inspire attempts to restore our lost years, efforts that the gods apparently wished to prevent. Today, we feel the echo of this memory in our universal fear of death and our ceaseless search for ways to extend human life in the myths of fountains of youth and elixirs of immortality that appear in every culture, in our intuitive sense that death is somehow unnatural and wrong, and in the strange grief we feel for a loss we cannot name, as though somewhere deep within us we remember what it was to look forward to centuries of life rather than mere decades. If our lifespans were shortened, then perhaps we were also meant to forget what could be accomplished in a longer life. And the fourth erased memory concerns the civilization that flourished when humans still lived for millennia, a golden age whose glory surpassed anything we have achieved since. The fourth erased event takes us to a world that existed before the Great Flood, a civilization so advanced and so harmonious that its memory, had it survived, would make everything we have built since seem primitive by comparison. A world where the gods walked openly among humans and shared their knowledge freely, where the cities shone with technologies we can barely imagine, and where humanity lived in a state of connection and understanding that we have never been able to recapture. The Sumerian texts speak of this antediluvian world in terms of both wonder and warning, describing cities that existed before the flood, such as Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak, each governed by gods who taught humanity the arts of civilization. And while these city names would be used again after the flood for new settlements built on the ruins, the original cities possessed a character and capability that the later versions could only dimly reflect. In those ancient days, according to the texts, the boundaries between gods and humans were far more permeable than they would later become, with the Anunnaki dwelling in great temple complexes called ziggurats, where humans could approach them and receive instruction, and this direct contact produced a civilization of remarkable sophistication, one that understood the movements of the heavens, the secrets of medicine and agriculture, the mysteries of writing and mathematics, and perhaps even technologies that we would recognize as advanced by our own standards. The texts suggest that humanity in this era developed spiritual capacities that have since atrophied, abilities to perceive and communicate with beings beyond ordinary sight, to heal through the manipulation of subtle energies, and to access knowledge through means other than the physical senses, capabilities that the gods had originally granted but later decided were too dangerous for a species they had created to serve them. Yet this civilization ultimately failed to satisfy its creators, and the texts record that Enlil, the chief administrator of the Anunnaki on Earth, grew increasingly displeased with humanity, disturbed by our noise, our proliferation, and perhaps by the very advancement that the gods themselves had fostered, until finally he determined that this experiment must end and the slate must be wiped clean. The memory of the pre-flood civilization was erased, the texts suggest, because to remember our former heights would make our current state unbearable, inspiring either despair at what was lost or dangerous ambition to reclaim what was taken from us. And either response would interfere with the quiet development the gods had planned for the remnant of humanity that survived. We feel the echo of this memory in the persistent legends of lost golden ages that appear in every culture, in stories of Atlantis and Lemuria and Eden. In our sense that human history is not a story of constant progress, but of rise and fall and rise again. And in the archaeological mysteries that hint at sophisticated knowledge in the distant past that cannot be explained by conventional historical models. This civilization was destroyed in what the Sumerians called the Great Catastrophe, but the memory of the flood itself was not fully erased, only humanity's role in causing it, and the debates among the gods about whether we deserve to survive. The fifth, erased event concerns the true nature of the Great Flood, an event remembered in cultures around the world, but stripped of its most crucial details, the knowledge that it was not a natural disaster, but a deliberate act of destruction decided upon by a council of beings who held our fate in their hands. The Sumerian flood narratives, preserved in texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis, provide a strikingly different account than the sanitized versions we have inherited, revealing that the flood was the result of a divine decision to exterminate humanity. A genocide planned and executed by the very beings who had created us, and that we survived only because one God chose to defy the will of the assembly and save a remnant of our species. According to these texts, Enlil brought the matter before the council of the Anunnaki, complaining that the noise of humanity disturbed his rest and that we had multiplied beyond what was useful, arguing that we should be destroyed and the experiment ended, and the assembled gods, perhaps weary of the complications that humanity had introduced into their affairs, agreed to his proposal and swore an oath to keep the decision secret from the doomed species. But Enki, who had designed humanity and felt a creator's affection for his creation, could not bear to see his work destroyed utterly. And so he found a way to circumvent his oath without technically breaking it, going not to a human directly, but to a wall of reeds, and speaking as though to himself about the coming catastrophe, knowing that a wise man named Utnapishtim was sleeping on the other side of the wall and would hear every word. Utnapishtim, warned by this seeming accident, built a great vessel according to specifications Enki provided, sealed it with pitch, and loaded it with his family, skilled craftspeople, and the seed of all living things, so that when the waters rose and covered the earth, destroying the cities and the civilization that humanity had built, a remnant survived to begin again in a world washed clean of its former glory. When the flood receded and Enlil discovered that humanity had survived, he was furious at the betrayal. But Enki argued persuasively that complete extinction would have been a waste, and eventually Enlil was reconciled to the continuation of our species, though on different terms than before, with reduced lifespans and limited capacities that would prevent us from ever again rising to the heights we had previously achieved. The true cause of the flood was erased from human memory, the texts suggest, because knowledge that the gods had nearly destroyed us and could do so again at will would make trust and worship impossible, breeding fear and resentment rather than the grateful obedience the gods desired. And so, the flood was recast in human memory as a punishment for sin rather than an act of annoyance, a moral lesson rather than an administrative decision. We feel the echo of this memory in the flood myths that appear in virtually every culture around the world, in the persistent sense that we once did something to deserve punishment, in our complex relationship with the divine that mixes love with fear, and in the strange gratitude we feel toward forces we cannot name for allowing us to continue existing, as though some part of us remembers how close we came to total extinction. Humanity survived, but emerged into a changed world, and the sixth erased memory concerns what happened immediately after the waters receded, the moment when human communication was forever altered. The sixth erased event occurred in the generations following the flood, when the survivors and their descendants had multiplied again and spread across the earth. And when humanity, perhaps remembering dimly what had been lost, attempted to rebuild and to reach once more toward the heavens from which their creators had come, an effort that would provoke another intervention in human affairs, one that would fragment our species in ways that persist to this very day. The texts tell us that in those early days after the catastrophe, all of humanity spoke a single language, a unified tongue that allowed perfect communication between all peoples, enabling cooperation and coordination on a scale that would never again be possible. And with this linguistic unity came a dangerous potential, the ability to work together toward goals that the gods had not sanctioned. Humanity, according to the traditions preserved in multiple cultures, undertook a great building project, a tower or structure that would reach into the heavens, perhaps attempting to create a way to access the realm of the gods, or to demonstrate capabilities that the Anunnaki had believed were no longer possible for our diminished species. And this act of ambition alarmed those who watched from above. The Sumerian texts describe what happened next with remarkable directness, stating that Enki, the Lord of Wisdom, changed the speech in the mouths of humanity, transforming what had been one language into many, so that those who had worked together in perfect understanding suddenly found themselves unable to comprehend one another, their words becoming gibberish, their collaborative efforts collapsing into confusion and frustration. With the confusion of tongues came the scattering of peoples, as groups that could communicate with each other separated from groups they could no longer understand, us migrating to different regions and eventually developing into distinct cultures and civilizations, each with its own language and customs and gods, the original unity shattered into fragments that would never fully reunite. The texts suggest that this was not a punishment, but a preventive measure, designed to ensure that humanity could never again coordinate effectively enough to challenge the plans of the Anunnaki. And with our languages divided, we were given over to different gods who would oversee different territories, creating the system of competing pantheons and nations that has characterized human history ever since. The memory of our original linguistic unity was erased, the texts suggest, because to remember it would be to remember our former capability for cooperation and achievement. Inspiring attempts to restore what was taken and rebuild the unity that the gods had deliberately destroyed. Efforts that might eventually succeed if we understood clearly what we were trying to reclaim. We feel the echo of this memory in the story of the Tower of Babel, preserved in later traditions, in the persistent human dream of universal communication and global unity, in our efforts to create common languages and translation technologies, and in the strange sense of recognition we sometimes feel when encountering people from vastly different cultures, as though beneath our superficial differences we share something fundamental that was never fully erased. With language divided and peoples scattered, the stage was set for the seventh and final erased memory, perhaps the most significant of all, concerning the departure of the gods themselves and their promise to return. The seventh and final erased event brings us to the end of one era and the beginning of another, the moment when the Anunnaki, who had created, guided, punished, and preserved humanity, finally withdrew from direct involvement in our affairs, retreating from the earth they had colonized and leaving behind only echoes and promises that would become the foundation of human religion for thousands of years to come. The Sumerian king list documents this transition with characteristic precision, recording that kingship descended from heaven at the beginning of civilization and was held by the gods themselves or their immediate representatives. But after the flood and the subsequent reorganization of human affairs, kingship increasingly passed to human rulers who governed in the name of the gods rather than alongside them. And the divine presence that had once been tangible and immediate gradually faded into something more distant and symbolic. The texts suggest that the withdrawal was gradual rather than sudden, with the gods reducing their visibility and direct intervention over many generations, perhaps returning to wherever they had come from, perhaps simply retreating to locations on Earth where humanity could not follow, leaving behind the temples and traditions that would keep their memory alive even as their actual presence faded from human experience. Before their departure, according to scattered references in various texts, the gods made promises to their human subjects, speaking of cycles that would complete and ages that would end, hinting that when certain conditions were met or certain time periods had elapsed, they would return to Earth and resume their direct involvement in human affairs. And these promises would echo through the ages in the form of messianic expectations and apocalyptic prophecies that persist in virtually every human culture. The specific details of the departure and the promises were erased from human memory, the texts suggest, because to know precisely when the gods would return and what they expected to find would create unnatural development, with humanity simply waiting rather than growing, and because the gods perhaps wished to see what we would become on our own, without the certainty of their oversight to constrain our choices. We feel the echo of this memory in the universal human sense of waiting for something we cannot name. In the religious expectations of divine return found in every major tradition, in our persistent feeling that we have been left alone but not abandoned, watched from a distance by powers we can sense but no longer see, and in the strange grief that sometimes wells up for a loss we cannot remember, the departure of those we once knew and served and loved. These, then, are the 7 events that the ancient Sumerian texts suggest were deliberately removed from human memory, our engineered origin, our forgotten predecessors, our stolen longevity, our lost civilization, our near extinction, our shattered unity, and the departure of those who made us. 7 wounds in the fabric of human consciousness that still ache even though we have forgotten how they were inflicted. Are 7 gaps in our collective story that leave us perpetually searching for something we cannot quite identify. As we rest now in the knowledge of these erased memories, allow yourself to feel not despair, but wonder. For the very existence of these texts suggests that the erasure was never complete, that somewhere deep within the human mind, perhaps encoded in ways we do not yet understand, the full truth still waits to be recovered, and perhaps that recovery has already begun. And so we pause now in our journey through these ancient memories to consider something deeper, something that connects all 7 of these erased events like threads woven through a single tapestry. When we look at what was taken from human memory, a pattern emerges from the shadows, and this pattern tells us something profound about the nature of forgetting itself. Each of the 7 events we have explored tonight shares a common thread, for each one concerns the fundamental nature of what humanity truly is. The memory of our engineered origins would change how we see ourselves as a species. The knowledge of those who came before us would alter our understanding of our place in the long story of Earth. The truth of our original lifespan would transform our relationship with time and mortality. The glory of the antediluvian civilization would remind us of heights we once achieved. The reality of the flood as deliberate act would reshape our understanding of divine intention. The memory of our original unified language would reconnect us to a wholeness we have lost. And the specifics of the departure and the promise would give us something to consciously await, something to prepare for, something to hope for with clarity rather than vague longing. Every single one of these erased memories, when you truly consider them, points toward the same unsettling and yet somehow beautiful truth: that humanity may be far more than we currently believe ourselves to be. Each forgotten event suggests that we possess potential we do not recognize, origins we do not acknowledge, and a destiny we do not remember choosing. And perhaps this is precisely why these memories were taken, because beings who fully understood their own nature, their own origins, their own capabilities, such beings would be far more difficult to guide, far more difficult to control, far more difficult to keep working in the gardens and minds of the gods. But how does one erase a memory from an entire species? And how does one ensure that the forgetting persists across thousands upon thousands of years? The Sumerian texts hint at several methods that worked in concert across the ages. The first and most fundamental may have been genetic, woven into the very fabric of our created bodies. If the Anunnaki truly engineered humanity through the mixing of their essence with earthly clay, then perhaps they also engineered limitations into our design. Perhaps they created minds capable of forgetting, minds that would not retain certain categories of memory across generations, minds with built-in barriers against accessing deeper knowing. The second method was simpler and more brutal, the destruction of physical records. The Great Flood itself, whether natural or deliberate, would have washed away nearly every trace of the antediluvian world, every library, every monument, every written record of the time before. What the waters did not take, time and conquest would eventually claim, as later civilizations built their temples atop the ruins of earlier ones, as scrolls crumbled and tablets were buried beneath desert sands. The third method was perhaps the most elegant, the deliberate transformation of memory into myth. When a true event is retold as legend, when history becomes fairy tale, when the specific becomes the symbolic, the memory remains in some form but loses its power to inform and transform. The gods knew that humans would always tell stories, so rather than fight this tendency, they shaped it, guiding the narratives so that truth would hide in plain sight, dismissed as primitive imagination, as metaphor, as mere mythology. And the fourth method required no divine intervention at all, for it is simply the nature of collective memory to fade when not actively maintained. Without written records, without monuments, without rituals of remembrance, even the most significant events blur and dissolve across generations. What grandparents experienced becomes stories to grandchildren, and what those grandchildren tell their own descendants becomes legend. And what begins as legend eventually becomes nothing more than a strange feeling, a dream half remembered upon waking, a sense that something important has been lost. But this brings us to a question that has haunted philosophers and mystics across all the ages. Why would beings of such power and knowledge choose to make us forget? If the Anunnaki were truly our creators, if they truly guided us through the early millennia of our existence, why would they hide our own history from us? Perhaps, and we can only speculate here in the soft darkness of contemplation, perhaps some knowledge truly is dangerous. Perhaps understanding our engineered origins would have broken something essential in early human psychology, would have made us unable to function, unable to find meaning in our labors, unable to love and build and dream. Perhaps knowing the full truth of the flood and the divine debate would have poisoned our relationship with the cosmos, would have filled us with fear rather than wonder, and with resentment rather than gratitude. Perhaps the memory of our former lifespan would have made our shortened lives unbearable, would have turned every human heart toward bitterness at what was taken. Perhaps, in some strange way, forgetting was a gift. Perhaps we needed the freedom that comes from not knowing, the space to develop our own identity apart from the shadow of our makers, the opportunity to become something more than servants remembering their servitude. Perhaps the Anunnaki, or at least some among them, understood that for humanity to truly grow, we had to forget our childhood, had to step into a world where we believed ourselves to be alone, to be the protagonists of our own story, rather than merely the supporting cast in someone else's epic. And yet, even if we accept this possibility of protective forgetting, we cannot ignore the cost, for there is a persistent ache in the human soul, a feeling that something essential has been lost, a sense that we have forgotten something terribly important. Every culture on Earth tells stories of a golden age, a time before when things were better, when the gods walked among us, when we lived in harmony with each other and with nature. Every spiritual tradition speaks of a fall, a separation, a forgetting that must be overcome through practice and seeking and grace. We search and search for our origins, building telescopes to look at the stars, digging in the earth for bones and artifacts, sequencing our own genomes looking for clues. We feel, even those of us who consider ourselves thoroughly rational and modern, that we are being watched, that there is something larger going on, that our lives have significance beyond what we can see and measure. And in our dreams, especially in our dreams, images come to us that we cannot explain. Memories of places we have never been, knowledge of things we have never learned, encounters with beings we cannot name. Perhaps these dreams are nothing but the random firings of sleeping neurons. But perhaps they are fragments of what was taken, echoes of the erased events surfacing briefly in the one state of consciousness where the barriers thin and the forgetting loosens its grip. This, then, is the great paradox we are left to contemplate. If the memories were truly erased, if the forgetting was truly complete, then how is it that we are speaking of these things tonight? How did the clay tablets survive? How did the scribes of Sumer know what to write? How did these stories persist across 5,000 years of flood and fire and conquest and neglect? Perhaps the erasure was never complete. Perhaps it was never meant to be. Perhaps there were always those who were allowed to remember, or perhaps required to remember, priest and scribe and keeper of secret knowledge, passing the truth down through generations in coded myth and sacred text, waiting for the day when humanity would be ready to hear, waiting for the day when the forgetting would begin to lift. And perhaps that day is coming. Perhaps it is already here. For you are listening to these words now, and something in you recognizes them, something deeper than rational thought, something that has been waiting a very long time. And yet, we do remember. Not perfectly, not completely, but in fragments, in stories, in dreams. The texts survived, the questions persisted, and perhaps that was always the plan, that when we were ready, the memories would begin to return. The final section of our journey tonight examines where these memories may be surfacing now. What signs suggest that the veil of forgetting is beginning to lift, and what it might mean for humanity if we are indeed approaching a time of remembrance. And so we arrive at the present moment, at the world you and I inhabit tonight, and perhaps it is worth pausing here to notice something remarkable, something that the ancient scribes of Sumer could never have imagined when they pressed their reed styluses into wet clay thousands of years ago. We live now in an age when the very technologies described in those distant texts have begun to emerge from the realm of mythology into the laboratories and research centers of our modern world. Scientists today routinely modify the genetic code of living beings, splicing genes from one species into another, creating organisms that never existed in nature. And while we call this progress and innovation, the Sumerians would have recognized it instantly as the work of those who shape life itself. The process by which Ninmah was said to have mixed the essence of the gods with the clay of the earth finds its echo in the gleaming facilities where researchers now edit the very code of human existence. And beyond our own planet, serious scientists at respected institutions now openly discuss the theory of panspermia, Now, the idea that life on Earth may have been seeded from elsewhere in the cosmos, that the building blocks of biology drifted down from the stars, or were perhaps deliberately placed here by intelligences unknown. What was once dismissed as fringe speculation now appears in peer-reviewed journals and is debated at academic conferences, as if the collective human mind is slowly circling back toward questions the Sumerians answered 5 millennia ago. Then, there is the persistent mystery of consciousness itself, that strange light of awareness that looks out through your eyes even now, the one phenomenon that science has utterly failed to explain, and some researchers have begun to wonder whether awareness might be fundamental to the universe rather than merely a byproduct of brain chemistry. Whether mind itself might have existed before matter, which is precisely what the ancient texts seem to suggest when they speak of divine beings who thought the world into existence. And when we examine the fossil record with honest eyes, we find gaps and discontinuities in the human story that have never been adequately explained, sudden leaps in brain size and capability, the mysterious appearance of symbolic thought and art, as if something intervened at key moments to accelerate our development beyond what gradual evolution could achieve. But perhaps even more striking than these scientific parallels is the way these ancient themes have persisted in human culture across every continent and every age, refusing to fade despite thousands of years of forgetting. The flood that swept over the land in the Sumerian account appears with remarkable consistency in the traditions of peoples who had no contact with Mesopotamia, from the mountains of South America to the islands of the Pacific, from the frozen north to the heart of Africa, as if the memory of that great catastrophe was burned so deeply into the human psyche that even deliberate erasure could not fully remove it. In our own time, the ancient astronaut hypothesis has captured the imagination of millions, appearing in films and television programs and books that sell by the tens of millions. And while scholars may dismiss this fascination as mere entertainment, one might also wonder why such ideas resonate so powerfully if there is not some deeper chord being struck, some half-remembered truth trying to surface through the collective dream. Nearly every culture on Earth preserves some notion of a golden age, a time before time when humans lived in harmony with divine beings, when knowledge flowed freely and death had not yet taken its cold grip on mortal life. And this universal sense of paradise lost cannot be explained by mere coincidence or the borrowing of stories from one tradition to another. And everywhere you look, in religions and mythologies and even in secular hopes for the future, you find the narrative of return, the promise that those who departed will come back, that the teachers will return to their students, that the cycle will complete, and what was broken will be made whole again. Something seems to be stirring in our time, a quickening of interest in these ancient mysteries that goes beyond casual curiosity. And more people are studying the old texts now than at any point in human history. Translations are being made available. Tablets that sat in museum basements for a century are finally being deciphered. And with each new discovery, the picture grows more detailed and more strange. Archaeological finds continue to push back the timeline of human civilization, revealing sophisticated sites far older than conventional history allowed, suggesting that the story we have been told about our own past is incomplete at best. There is a feeling in the air, difficult to name but widely shared, that we stand on the edge of some great revelation, that the veils are thinning, and what was hidden is preparing to be known. And this brings us to the most profound question of all, a question you might hold gently as you drift towards sleep tonight. What would it mean if we truly remembered, if the 7 erased events were restored to human consciousness, and we knew at last where we came from and why we are here? Such knowledge would change everything about how we understand ourselves, our place in the cosmos, our relationship to the beings who may have shaped us, our responsibility to one another and to the world we inhabit. Perhaps we would feel less alone in the universe, knowing that others have walked this path before us, and that our existence is not merely an accident of chemistry, but a deliberate act of creation. Perhaps we would feel a new sense of purpose, understanding that we were made for something, even if we have forgotten what that something is. Or perhaps, and this too is worth considering, there is wisdom in not knowing, in allowing the mystery to remain a mystery, in trusting that whatever was hidden for a reason, and that the truth will emerge when we are ready to receive it. You need not decide tonight which path is right, whether to seek the forgotten memories or to rest peacefully in the not knowing. Both are valid responses to the great mystery. Both honor the journey we have taken together through these ancient stories and distant times. What matters is that you have opened yourself to wonder, that you have allowed your mind to travel beyond the boundaries of the everyday into the vast spaces where questions matter more than answers, and the search itself becomes a kind of homecoming. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through the mists of forgotten time, having traveled together through 7 moments that the ancient texts suggest were deliberately removed from the treasury of human memory. We began with the first erased event, the true origin of humanity itself, that startling claim found in the Atrahasis and other tablets that we were not simply evolved, but designed, crafted from the mingling of earthly clay and divine essence in the laboratories of beings who needed workers for their great enterprise. We then drifted further back to discover the second forgotten truth, that before us there were others, earlier attempts, different beings who walked this earth and tended the gardens of the gods before fading into the silence that preceded our arrival. The third memory taken from us concerned our original lifespan, those impossible numbers in the king lists, suggesting that early humans lived for thousands upon thousands of years before something changed, before our time was shortened, and we forgot we had ever known such lengthy existence. From there, we explored the 4th erased event, the magnificent civilization that flourished before the Great Flood, a world where gods walked openly among humans and knowledge flowed freely, a golden age now buried beneath waters and forgetting. The 5th memory concerned the flood itself, not as natural disaster, but as deliberate decision. The heated debates among the Anunnaki Council about whether humanity should be allowed to survive, and the secret defiance of Enki, who whispered warnings to the one who would build the ark. We then encountered the 6th forgotten truth, the separation of tongues, at that moment when unified humanity was scattered and our single language shattered into countless fragments, a division designed to prevent us from ever again working together with the power we once possessed. And finally, the 7th erased memory, perhaps the most haunting of all, the departure of these beings, their withdrawal from direct involvement in human affairs, and the promises they made about returning when the great cycle completes. 7 memories, 7 events that, according to these clay tablets inscribed 5,000 years ago, we were never meant to remember. And yet, here we are, speaking of them, wondering about them, as if somewhere deep within us the memories persist despite everything. What are we to make of such claims? The Sumerians did not write their accounts as mythology in the way we understand that word today. To them, these were not stories meant to explain natural phenomena or teach moral lessons through fiction. They recorded these events with the same careful attention they gave to administrative records, to trade agreements, to astronomical observations. In their minds, they were preserving history. Whether that history reflects literal events, symbolic truths, or something in between that our modern categories cannot quite capture remains an open question, and perhaps it should remain open. There is a certain wisdom in not forcing answers upon mysteries that have endured for millennia. The ancient sages themselves understood that some knowledge must be approached with humility, that the mind which grasps too tightly often crushes what it seeks to hold. The Sumerians knew this. They built their temples as bridges between worlds, acknowledging that humans stand in a middle place between the earth and the stars, between knowing and unknowing, between remembering and forgetting. Perhaps this is where we are meant to rest tonight, in that middle place, holding these mysteries gently rather than demanding they surrender their secrets. Not all questions require answers to serve their purpose. Sometimes the questioning itself is the gift, the wondering that opens us to possibilities we would never have considered, the contemplation that softens the rigid boundaries of what we think we know. The great teachers of every tradition have recognized that there is a knowledge beyond knowledge, an understanding that comes not from grasping, but from releasing, not from waking effort, but from the quiet receptivity of rest. And so, as we prepare to let these thoughts settle like sediment in still water, let us return one final time to that ancient land between the rivers. Imagine the sun setting over the ruins of Ur, over the crumbling ziggurats and the mounds that hide libraries of unread tablets. The sky shifts from gold to deep violet, and one by one the stars emerge, the same stars that the Sumerian priests watched and charted, the same stars that look down upon the events we have described tonight, if indeed those events occurred. In museums scattered across the world, clay tablets rest in climate-controlled cases, their wedge-shaped impressions holding stories that most visitors walk past without a second glance. But the stories wait. They have waited for 5,000 years already. They can wait longer. And perhaps tonight, as you drift towards sleep, some fragment of what we have discussed will settle into a place beyond ordinary memory, joining the great reservoir of human wondering that connects us across all the ages. The Sumerians believed that the gods would return. Many traditions hold similar hopes or fears. But whether anyone returns or not, whether any of this is literal history or elaborate metaphor, one thing seems certain. We are a species that asks questions about our origins. We are beings who sense, however vaguely, that something important has been forgotten. And in that very questioning, in that persistent feeling that there is more to our story than we currently know, perhaps we demonstrate that no memory can ever be fully erased. The tablets survived the fires that baked them hard. The stories survived the floods that buried them. The questions survive in us, passed down through countless generations who never read cuneiform, but who still look up at the night sky and wonder. And so we close our eyes tonight, holding these mysteries gently, like clay tablets in careful hands. The Sumerians wrote their stories, and somehow, despite everything, those stories reached us. Perhaps they were meant to. Perhaps in some distant future, when we have grown wise enough, the full memory will return. But for now, it is enough to wonder. It is enough to have journeyed, however briefly, into the deep past. The stars that looked down on ancient Sumer look down on you now. The same stars, the same questions. And somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, perhaps you remember more than you know. Rest now. Let the mysteries keep themselves. Tomorrow the questions will still be there, patient as clay, ancient as starlight, waiting for whenever you wish to return.